welcome everyone. We are still giving a few moments to get the opportunity for everyone to join. But we will start very soon. I'm giving it another half a minute where I'm still seeing the numbers rising. Just a few moments and we'll start very soon. Okay, so it is 1:03 where I am in Sydney. Good morning to those who are joining from other time zones. Good afternoon to everyone who's in afternoon time zone. We are happy to start our session as part of our ESG webinar series on climate risk. This webinar, as I said, is part of the ESG climate series that we are running at RSM. And if you're interested in any other ESG related webinars, do visit our webinar website. I believe that you will have the link in the chat very soon, where you can also see all the other webinars that we are running in the coming weeks and months and can register for them. Today, we are speaking about climate risks and how that impacts your business, but we are also speaking not only about businesses, but broader around climate risk assessments and planning and how that can be done in businesses, but also in the public sector. The speakers today is me, myself, and also my colleague, Corinne. I myself am ESG and Climate Services Partner. I am located in Sydney, and Corinne is a Director, ESG and Climate Services. She is located in Perth. Our ESG team is fairly large. We are growing. We are close to 40 people, and we are located in various geographies, and we are servicing clients on various ESG topics across Australia and also internationally. So let's get started. The agenda today will walk us through the Australian regulatory environment that brings the question of climate risks to the top of priorities for companies and private sector alike. What is climate risk and how does it impact the business? So the conceptuals behind the concepts and the principles behind climate risk and the practicalities around how do you go about assessing it, and then also about identifying and managing that climate risks, and also talking about disclosures and how you can report on everything that you're doing in your climate risk, both as part of your mandatory disclosures, but also your voluntary disclosures, and the bigger picture of how that integrates in your broader ESG management sustainability strategies and targets. Go ahead. I will start with walking through the upcoming mandatory climate-related disclosures and the related requirements. First of all, I would like to talk about a thought leadership piece that we have published that was analysis of some of the mandatory reporters that are due to be reporting on mandatory climate-related disclosures starting from next year or the upcoming years, depending on which reporting group they are in. We did this assessment of a considerable proportion of the mandatory reporters, and some of the conclusions that we saw coming out of this assessment were quite alarming, or at least interesting. We did see that, for example, 64% of mandatory reporters currently do not publish sustainability reports. 61% of companies have not reported their Scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions. And many do not have targets for either Scope 1 or 2 or 3 emissions. However, the most alarming number was the 74% of Group 1 reporters, so the ones that will need to be reporting the earliest, starting potentially from next year, have not done climate scenario analysis. And seeing this outcome and seeing that potentially there is a large group of entities out there in the private sector that would have mandatory requirements to assess and manage their climate change risks and report on that, may not have done that before, may not have done their climate risk assessments, and may not have reported, that made us think that we need to put some effort into providing more education and more detail on what can be done and how practically to approach that to help these companies be prepared. And that is something that we have tried to do with this report and also with this webinar and in our direct engagements with our clients. Let's go ahead. that will describe the upcoming mandatory climate-related requirements, climate-related reporting requirements. As you know, these are 3 parallel processes that are all quite close to their end stages. So we are about to see the full adoption of both the 2 amendments of 2 acts, the Corporations Act and the ASIC Act, that is being championed by the Treasury. That process currently is in the stage where will be introduced to Senate in August, and it is likely that it will be adopted in Senate in August. The second parallel process is the Australian Accounting Standards Board developing the implementing technical standards that describe exactly what disclosures are required and how they need to be prepared. And the finalization of those standards is likewise expected in August. And the third parallel process is carried out by Australian Audit and Assurance Standards Board, which are developing the assurance regime and requirements and also standard for assuring these disclosures, which we are expecting by the end of this year. So as a snapshot overview, these requirements are due to be phased in from 1st of January 2025, and we can go through a little bit more detail on how exactly that phasing looks like. The overall approach is climate first. However, the recent announcement by AASB, who are currently updating the standards based on the previous drafts, indicates that there is a wish to align closer with the international standards and also on a voluntary basis incentivize reporting on broader sustainability beyond climate. Over time, it's also expected that there would be more detailed standards covering other sustainability topics. And we already know that most likely nature and biodiversity could be the next topic that would follow climate. So all these concepts that we're talking about, climate risk assessment, would also apply, for example, for assessing your nature-related risks. Although there are certain specificities, however, the core concepts may be the same. And if you've carried out your climate risk assessment, you may already be better prepared to carry out similar assessments on their other sustainability objectives as well. These disclosures are to be part of your annual report, so they need to be published at the same time as your financial annual report and in the same document pack. It does follow the same principles as financial reporting of clear, concise, effective representation, and also reasonable basis. So really what the government is trying to do is bring the mandatory climate disclosure reporting at a similar quality and robustness level as financial reporting here. And as I said, it also requires assurance over these disclosures. The key metrics here are around the scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions and various aspects of mitigation and managing your greenhouse gas emissions. But a really important part, and equally important, maybe even the more important part, is managing your exposures to climate change related physical and transition risks. And to do that, to assess those risks, the recommendation is to use climate change scenario analysis using at least 2 possible futures, and that needs to be done for near, medium, and long term. This is an important matter. It also is linked to a liability regime for company directors that applies the existing liability regime that already applies for financial reporting, and the penalties are equally severe. So this is something that companies absolutely do need to pay attention to and make sure that once the mandatory reporting requirements come into place, that everyone's prepared and well confident in the disclosures that are being put in those reports. Next slide, please. This characterizes the staggered implementation and the application of the mandatory reporting requirements for the 3 key groups of reporters. I will not go through this in detail. Many of you will already be aware of that. And we can also share the slide deck for your reference going forward. And this table is also present in our publications online. We can direct you to those. But this does illustrate the timing of when the different reporting requirements start for the different sizes of reporters, and also the key reporting metrics or content, and also the level of assurance that would be required on the different types of disclosures. Still a disclaimer, this is still draft, so this is still to change. So we will have an update on this in August as expected. As you can see here, already from the very first years of reporting, risk assessment is included and also requires limited assurance. If we move forward, these are the 4 pillars of reporting. The reporting requirements are organized in 4 pillars, and in the shaded points, you can see where climate change risk integrates in these pillars and requirements of disclosures. As you can see, they do integrate in every single of the pillars, and we will go through a bit more detail on how exactly. Very briefly, governance talks about all the governance systems you have in place in terms of how you managed your climate change risks, how you integrate them into your strategic decision making, and what incentivizes managers to act in accordance with climate-related targets and objectives in the company. The strategy is twofold. It asks you to report on how climate change impacts are affecting your business strategy, but then also what is your strategy to manage those risks and reduce those potential impacts. The overall risk management is where you disclose all the technical details on how you identify, assess, prioritize climate change risks and opportunities, all the inputs and parameters. So this is your methodology section where you describe all the processes in place and how it's being done. And metrics and targets requires you to report on specific metrics. Some of those are predefined metrics and some of those are voluntary metrics that companies may be using. One of those predefined metrics, or the predefined metrics do cover also, for example, percentage of assets that are at risk for climate change impacts. Let's go ahead. I will now be handing over to Karin to talk us through more of the conceptual side of climate risk and some of the practicalities of how to carry out those assessments.
Thanks, Linda. Linda gave a really good segue into when we think about what does climate change look like at the moment. And a key word, and you'll hear us use that quite often this morning, is about integration. We've, similarly to sustainability reporting, moving away from kind of overarching, very, as we like to refer to, very fuzzy type of reporting into something more systemic and quantifiable. Climate risk and our understanding of climate risk has also evolved. It's no longer just about looking at or just thinking about the polar ice caps melting. It is about a range of different economic, financial, systemic risks that are integrated and should be integrated in how we think about business. If we look at some of the news articles that just appeared over the last 4 months, 5 months in Australia specifically, we have news articles related to increased periods of droughts and severe concerns around our agricultural capabilities. That's also linked to, for instance, some of our previous defense participants or defense ministers coming out and saying that there's been a lack of integration of climate change in as far as that could implicate national defense and issues around national security, particularly when it comes to elements around food security or food insecurity. This also relates to our relationships and potential relationships with some of our Pacific neighbors. So again, taking these two aspects which are in complete opposite from one another and bringing them together in this socioeconomic aspect or the socioeconomic context shows us how climate change is integrated, how the different risks are integrated, and how we need to look at this from a business perspective. We can similarly look at concerns around the rising energy costs. We know that we need to start thinking about diversifying our energy portfolio. That is very rapidly being used as a major political component and political narrative. And at the same time, we know that families all over Australia are struggling with regards to the cost of living. So thinking about how the grid is going to change and what that might mean at a household level is something that we need to consider. In addition to that, Linda has now illustrated the changing nature of disclosure requirements for companies, and something that used to be quite removed from what companies think about or how they develop strategy or risk on a day-to-day basis is now front and center of how we should be considering and what we should be looking at from a risk perspective. We wanted to highlight 2 recent studies as well. On the colorful chart indicates that's recent research released by S&P Global. This looks at the exposure of global economic sectors to several different types of climatic events, from floods, droughts, bushfires, extreme weather events. And it ranks how these different weather events or how these different climatic impacts could impact each of these economic sectors. And as you would see illustrated with the vertical blue line, that almost a third of global, more than a third of global economic sectors indicated that there are high risks associated with these weather events. And as I said, in a time where we feel that climate is perhaps moving off the agenda, this is a very recent study showcasing that these concerns, these risks, are still at the top of key agendas. At the same time, there have been several studies looking at climate change litigation. Interestingly enough, and this is also referenced in RSM's research report, second only to the United States, Australia is the most litigious country when it comes to climate change cases. At the moment, we have 132 different cases in various different phases in the judicial system related to climate change. In addition to that, Australia was also one of the few countries which over the past year grew significantly from a shareholder and a stakeholder activism perspective, and climate being a key driving force of some of those issues. So we have an interesting dynamic playing out at the moment. In a global context where we're faced with major physical climate-related risks, which would have immediate impacts on these economic sectors, coupled with, of course, the global transition to a lower carbon economy and what that means from a government commitment perspective. We also have pressures being driven from shareholders and stakeholders in terms of wanting to see action, wanting to understand how risk manifests within strategy, how risk is incorporated into the long-term pivot or the long-term business resilience of a particular company. And this is going to continue to play out in different levels across Australia. Climate risk, as we've just indicated, looks very different. We have, and can look very different. We have physical risk, which is both acute and chronic. Acute in the sense of flash flooding, major storms, those would be acute events. Chronic events are your long-term systemic climatic changes, drought, increased ambient temperatures are good examples. But then you also have what we refer to transitional risks, and we'll delve into that a bit later on. Transitional risks are related to these impacts and what's being put in place to respond to these impacts. But transitional risks also relate to the systemic change in terms of decarbonizing, moving towards net zero, greener economies, sustainable finance, and what that means from a reputational perspective, what that means from a company resilience perspective. And then, of course, you also have indirect related risks associated with each of these with both physical and transitional risks. A good example of indirect risk is already in the course of this last year, there's been about 30 to 40,000 climate refugees within Australia itself as a result of flash flooding and severe storms. This is an indirect risk and an indirect pressure on our urban systems, which we need to consider when we think about climate change. Climate risk comprises three different elements. The first is exposure, or the first is the hazard or the driver. Apologies. Your hazard or your driver are the events, the actual aspect that would relate in a risk. Think about your flash flooding. Think about extreme temperatures, severe storms. Those are your hazards or your risk drivers. The second is related to exposure, and exposure is about how exposed a specific facility, a business, a value chain, a company is to these specific or these identified risk drivers. And then finally, and this is the more subtle consideration, is vulnerability. And vulnerability is about the propensity of a company or a facility to be adversely affected by these severe weather events. A way to think about vulnerability is also to consider how sensitive is a particular company, organization, business, local government to the impacts of climate change. And does this company, organization, local government have adaptive capacity, means in which it can address both the hazard or change its exposure to a specific hazard? When we think about climate risk, it's also back to Linda's point, or about the integration, it's not just about an isolated impact. It is about what happens at your business at the forefront, what happens in terms of your value chain, where in your value chain do you have specific climate-related risks, and it's also about the macro context. What does your business do? Where does your business operate? Are there environmental or social considerations that would increase the sensitivity associated with climate risk related to your operations? What we've also done is looked at these 4 elements of reporting that's now required, and we've linked them to these components of climate risk. Climate change very often seems so far away, as we've said, from what we deal with from a business resilience point at a day-to-day basis. But it's important to understand that these actions are integrated and can be easily integrated into the way we think about business. Exposure and vulnerability, as an example, these are key aspects which you already consider from a business strategy perspective. Risk management already considers different risk drivers, exposure, appetite, and ways in which you mitigate risk. Looking at risk now requires that climate lens. And finally, of course, exposure and hazards and drivers, both of these allow you to extract metrics for reporting purposes, and this is all underpinned by governance and decision making. I'm handing back to Linda, who's going to give us an overview of the first stab assessment in Australia.
Thanks, Corinne. So what I will be speaking about is what action Australia is taking on adaptation, because of course, companies do not act in isolation. They do act as part of their communities, as part of the economy. And so the question is, what's happening on the federal levels, what's happening on the state levels, what are the underlying actions the government is taking that would also support the private sector adaptation? And one of the core roles that government can provide in adaptation is providing information, doing proper, deep, detailed risk assessments that may need to be done on macro level on the national scale to provide information for everyone operating in the economy in terms of easing their own risk assessments and providing the data sets that are needed for everyone to manage their own risks. And why is it important? It's also important because back in 2012, the 3 government levels in Australia came together and they agreed on the roles in adaptation for everyone in the society. And what came out of that was very clearly that government does not see it their role to manage the climate change risks of either companies or households, that companies and households should be taking care of their risk assessments and managing those risks themselves. However, the government role was foreseen to provide information, education, knowledge, and awareness and tools for enabling those assessments. And so what we are currently having is the process which is carrying out a national climate change risk assessment. And this is some examples that are coming out of the first path assessment. So we currently have is a report which on a very high level qualitative assessment indicates where the biggest risks are in the economy as a whole and in specific sectors. So what we currently have on this slide, it is the hazards impacting mostly the economy, trade and finance system. And so you can see that there are certain aspects that are already of high concern currently, and not speaking about 2050 or 2090 timelines where majority of climate change related hazards would become high concern. The next slide is another example. It talks about another sector that is more infrastructure and the built environment. And again, you can glean the level of impact from the different types of climate hazards on specific sectors from this first pass high level qualitative climate risk assessment. Now, the next steps what the government will be taking is an in-depth national climate risk assessment, and we're expecting the results of that. There are other processes being put in place to the specific authority that's designed, designated to provide, gather, collate, model, and provide climate-related data. So that is another support going forward. Everyone in the society, both the companies, communities, public sector, anyone would have access to enable their climate risk assessments. But of course, these already high-level risk examples, assessment risk examples, give us quite a good insight into the fact that every sector will be affected, and most sectors will be affected at a level that is high concern. And that really should be the incentive of companies, not because of the mandatory disclosures to carry out these risk assessments, but your self-interest of ensuring that the business can continue for a period of time in the near and medium future, and also in the long-term future, still maintaining their level of performance, both financially and from sustainability perspective. I think I will be going back to Corinne to talk us through some of the practicalities of climate change risk assessment.
Thanks, Linda. Just to add, we've spoken a lot about the changing nature and how we understand climate risk, and we've illustrated this with some practical examples. The key to climate risk, similarly to when we tackle sustainability, is really understanding where does that leave your business? Where is your business, your organization, the sector in which you operate? Where is that exposed? What does that exposure look like? And to understand what kind of mitigation or resilience measures to put in place in that respect. We've mentioned briefly that climate risk is divided, or climate risk is normally defined into two categories. The first is your physical risk, and then the second is transitional. I should also mention, my colleague Catherine's really good at reminding me about this. It's not just about risk, although today's webinar is very much focused on risk, but there are inherent opportunities associated with sectoral shifts, associated with low carbon, associated with policy changes. If we think about the rapid uptake of solar, of wind energy, of alternative energy, if we think about policy changes which have enabled the uptake of these technologies, or if we think about the Future Made in Australia policy perspective that's being put at the table at the moment, the notion of large-scale localized beneficiation, these are all major opportunities to get behind, major economic opportunities brought about by discussions, by thinking, how do we, as a country, how do we contribute effectively to a low-carbon economy? Back to understanding and unpacking some of the risks. Key to what we need to do from a disclosure perspective is to start thinking and is to start quantifying the climate-related risks. It's no longer just a question of saying we're exposed to severe weather, we're exposed to flash flooding. Increasingly, there's a need for investors to understand exactly what that exposure looks like and where are you exposed from a financial perspective. As we've mentioned, physical risks is about those it's about the immediate impacts of climate, both acute and chronic. And transitional risks are a bit more salient in nature. This deals with regulatory changes. It deals with the reputational aspects of a business, products, goods and services, the changing nature of markets for and the demand and the supply of certain goods and services. And of course, your ability to access and continue to access some of these value chains. What we're looking at from a financial quantification perspective is really, how does this affect your bottom line? How does it affect your assets and liabilities? How does it affect your revenue, your capital expenditure, or your access to capital and financing going forward? So that financial quantification is really that's really what we need to start thinking about when we talk about risks, when we talk about opportunities, and how do you quantify those risks and opportunities? We've put together 2 case studies, which we'll go through now, in terms of showing you how we've identified risks for different types of clients and then quantified those risks from a financial perspective as well. So we've spoken about climate, physical, and transitional risks. And then we've also spoken about the components of climate risk being driven by hazards. There's an exposure element, and then of course understanding your vulnerability or sensitivity and adaptive capacity to be able to manage these different risks. We've worked with a gold mining company. Gold mining company was a listed company. They've operations in both Australia as well as in 2 different developing economies. They had both a few assets that were going into closure and rehabilitation, but then they also had major life of mine, long-term life of mine assets continuing, as well as an exploration arm specifically in one of the developing economies. When we start looking and quantifying, before we get to the quantification part, when we start looking for climate risk, one of the methodologies that we apply is, of course, the appropriation or the localization of the different climate change models. The challenge with the localization of climate change models is the fact that those are, and that is very rapidly changing. Linda's mentioned government tools, which are becoming available to ease how we look at climate risk. But the challenge with these global models very often, particularly for companies that operate in far-flung or more remote areas, is that they're not very granular in nature. So being able to plot what these models mean from a more immediate, short and medium-term perspective is often very difficult. What we found is coupling this historic weather, or coupling future-looking weather models with historic weather modeling has been really helpful. Looking at historic weather modeling helps us to analyze the future-looking models and to understand to what extent is heating going to impact this specific operation. To what extent is the projected severe weather or flash flooding going to impact this operation if we look at what's happened in the past 30 years? So that's been something that we've looked at. Trends analysis is really valuable in, again, appropriating global climate models and then making sure that we have an operational reference point, understanding the specific operational parameters of a company to then say, these are relevant risks. These risks would impact area X, Y, or Z of a particular business. So for this specific company, and we do the same with regards to transitional risks. On the transitional side, we just take a slightly different consideration when it comes to the regulatory changes and considering the costs and potential costs associated with those regulatory changes. For this particular company, we found that both flash flooding and increased temperatures were going to be major risks going forward. This was also evident in the trends analysis we did looking at the historic weather challenges. In addition, we found that one of the countries in which the company operates was going to implement quite a stringent carbon tax on direct emissions. But at the same time, this particular company or this particular country was also implementing a very forward-thinking and a large-scale solar subsidized program for solar-related energy. From a physical perspective, the company was quite exposed in terms of the flash flooding. They had in this particular developing economy where they were operating, they had very limited access to the major road and rail network that they needed in order to move their product. This was as a result of the remote location. This is as a result of the spatial configuration of this particular country. And any kind of flash flooding event would just wash away the roads and make it basically impossible to move any product back and forth. This just ground their ability to be able to move products to an absolute halt. In addition, from a heat perspective, in one of the areas that they were mining, they were looking at a new underground asset, and they already had high concerns around the high ambient temperatures and the fact that they didn't have reliable energy. In terms of exposure from a transitional perspective, there was high exposure in terms of this carbon taxation, of the carbon taxation that was being proposed. This was as a result of the fact that they were dependent on the national grid, which was a coal-based grid. So from a Scope 2 emission perspective, the carbon tax would hit them really hard financially, also in terms of their growth projections. They did have, and they were considering putting in solar and battery operated systems for their underground operations specifically. And they were also working on a social investment project implementing a day clinic which required energy. So there was a major opportunity for them to make use of the government subsidy in terms of solar and getting these projects off the ground. As we've indicated, very vulnerable in terms of the roads and the road network. So that was a major risk and something that they had to model and implement a mitigation plan in terms of the moving of their ore. And from a vulnerability perspective in terms of the energy, given that they had the subsidy and access to the subsidy for solar power, their business plan to extend and expand their energy for their new underground asset made a lot of sense. They were able to mitigate that particular risk. From a vulnerability perspective, unfortunately, their long-term asset, they did have to raise an impairment as a result of the way in which the taxation system was staggered, and the fact that they couldn't, on a large scale, reduce their energy consumption from energy and the energy reliance on the grid. In terms of the as I mentioned, the two solar projects that they were thinking of, new assets underground, as well as their corporate social investment, the subsidized scheme enabled them to expand those projects effectively. Thinking about costing, the fact that they could not move their assets had a direct impact on their revenue. The fact that they had to source or were looking at sourcing solar to assist in terms of the underground operations had an immediate impact on their expenditures. The subsidy eased that immediately, and that also enabled a freer flow in terms of revenue. From a financial perspective or from the transitional perspective, obviously raising the impairment had an impact on their assets and liabilities. And again, solar had an impact on their capital and on the financing side of things, capital in terms of what they could bring in and financing the additional subsidy that they had access to. I'm handing over to Linda for a local government case study.
Thank you, Corinne. Thanks a lot. Very valuable practical example. Before I go ahead, I've been hearing from one person that they may not be seeing the slides or have difficulty seeing the slides. If that is the case for you, we will make sure that the slides are shared and also the recording of the webinar is shared. So whoever may be missing out, that you can revisit that after. And also a reminder, there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please use that button. If you have any questions that are already on top of your mind, please type them in. We will try and address them at the end of the webinar. All right, so let's switch to the public sector and how climate change risk assessments and management and reporting on that can be done on a local government scale. Myself, I have been working on setting up the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is one of the largest non-state actors network that have made climate change commitments, both on mitigation, adaptation, and energy security. And I have been helping set up the adaptation side of this initiative, looking into how these commitments look like, but then also what should be a good adaptation plan for a local government. And over the years, I have supported several hundred of these signatories of the Global Covenant of Mayors in helping them make these adaptation plans better in terms of also improving the way they do their climate risk assessments, and then they have how they plan the adaptation actions and communicate those plans. So out of those many entities that I have been working with on the local level, I quickly take a look at the list, and I realized that most of them would be publishing their climate risk assessments and plans not in English, but in local languages. So not to bore you with Hungarian or Icelandic, I decided to use Ghent as an example here because they helpfully publish things in English. And also, of course, we do have in Australia certain local governments that are also signatories of the Global Covenant of Mayors or intend to be. So we could also look at those examples. In this case, it is Ghent because Ghent has been doing this for a very long time. And so they have been working on this and refining their approach over a longer period of time. So significant expertise and experience there that we could learn from. So how does the process look like for a local government when they talk and walk through the process of assessing their risks? Well, first of all, you have to measure and understand what the risks are. And for a local government, it very often will look like this, right? It will look like physical representation of the different ways of understanding what your current and future risks are. Very often it will be based in direct measurements. So here on the left side, we see a direct measurement, which is satellite-based measurement of surface temperature, which is used as one input. And then on the right side, we see modeled outputs that model the urban heat island effect. Because they didn't have direct measurements of urban heat island effect, they did measure both the current impact of this urban heat island effect, but then also could use that model to then project how that will change over time in near, medium, and long term under different climate change scenarios. So both options here will be important. And as I said, there are different types of inputs that they used for this. Ghent is based in Belgium. Belgium had a national climate risk assessment. They could use some data from that. They also are based in Wallonie, which is the region, and the region also had a climate risk assessment. They could use the data from that. They did their own measurements, so they did hire people who went out and also did, let's say, drive-by measurement of heat, for example, if we focus on the heat hazard. And they also hired external consultants for certain aspects where they couldn't do the things themselves or didn't have data sources. So there is a combination of different sources that you might need to use to understand your risks fully. Next slide, please. So once they have modeled and understand and mapped out the climate risks, they went through a process of characterizing those risks to understand how to prioritize them and where to focus their actions as a priority. And this is a very, very simple example. This is just a public output that they have published on the Global Climate of Mayors website, but it was more detailed, and it also involved other perspectives, such as also the level of the impact itself. However, here we're looking at two characteristics. We're looking at the probability and the timescale, because these two characteristics help them prioritize these actions. And out of this, as we can see, the three top hazards that they would need to focus on is the drought, extreme hot temperatures, and extreme precipitations that also then lead to flash flooding within the city. So this helped them prioritize these things. So the next step then, in the next slide, is to start thinking about quantification. How do we quantify what exactly is the current state, what will look in the future, and therefore how do we adapt and adjust the actions that would need to be taken to address some of those risks. And this is, again, I used an example only of the heat hazard. So they used various different metrics and, again, different data sources that they could find on characterizing of how the heat problem looks like now, how much of the vulnerable populations are affected now and will be in 2050 and 2100. As we can see, by 2050, almost 100% of vulnerable populations in their modeling would be affected by higher heat levels. The next step that Ghent undertook is understanding what the drivers are of these problems. Again, using the heat example, this is one aspect of the drivers where they looked at sealed surfaces, because they do understand the more sealed surfaces we have in the urban fabric, the less vegetation we have, the higher the heat island effect. So they looked at the level of influence of these different drivers, and they did look beyond this, not only on the urban fabric, other drivers as well. And then as a next step, they could start planning the actions that could be taken to address these drivers and reduce those parameters. That is on the next slide. The slide illustrates how they have designed, thought about how these different solutions could look like, and then assess the advantages and disadvantages of these different solutions. Now, this is a very simple qualitative assessment. Some entities, both businesses and local governments, actually do a quantified cost-benefit assessment or another net present value assessment or other quantified assessment that also involve the costs, the timing, the quantified benefits and disbenefits to compare different adaptation options, to then decide which ones of those are better suited or easier to implement or maybe less costly to implement than the alternatives. And then the next steps are to put that into a plan. That is on the next slide. If you click one more time or two times, then we see the, let's go back forward. Yes, thank you. Let's stop here. We see how Ghent has been planning. So by now, the city of Ghent is already at their third climate action plan. And I have put in screenshots there of their first plan, which I really liked because it not only lists the specific action, but it also lists who exactly needs to do this action, who needs to be involved outside of the actual lead of who will be leading the action, the time frame for implementation, and also indication of where the budget would come from and what the amount of money necessary for this would need to be. This is a really good example of very high level, very good quality climate action plan or adaptation plan. Now, their newer climate plan, which is now on the top example, goes into less specific detail, at least in the public report, but it still describes the action and it describes who would be responsible and who would need to participate in the implementation of it. And then the next slide, lastly, what you also need to do, and what is very important, especially in the context of the public sector is to budget for it, to foresee the specific amount that's necessary in the budget, but then also monitor the implementation and define specific metrics that are being used to track both implementation, but then also the actual impact or reduction of the hazard, in this case, for example, heat reduction. If we go ahead, then the last step, and that should not be missed, especially if you are a local government, to communicate with your community. It's really important that everyone living in the city, in this case Ghent, or in a local government area, would be on board, would understand what the local government is trying to do, what the key actions would be, and what is the end vision, and how they can be part of that. And this is where I again want to stress that local government adaptation and company and household adaptation should not be two separate things. These should be closely integrated. We need to make sure that the efforts of what the local government is doing do not contradict the efforts of the business, or vice versa. That the businesses and households get all the support they can have in terms of knowledge, data, perhaps certain financial incentives to implement their adaptation. That we're moving towards the end goal altogether and trying to achieve that resilient community status at the end. All right, so I'll end up this public sector example here, and back to Corinne. This would pull together how everything that we spoke about so far comes together in your disclosures. So Corinne, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. So one of the things that the standard requires you to do is to report on scenario analysis, potentially. The challenge with climate change and climate change risk, particularly when it gets to quantifying climate risk, is the variability of what we deal with. We've spoken about models and having to downscale and localize model, having to confirm and cross-reference that with other data sets. As we've mentioned, the challenge with climate is the variability. Scenario analysis is a way in which we can try and mitigate that variability by identifying specific parameters which could give you a specific output, in which case you would then be able to quantify impact or quantify the potential financial impact of a particular risk. The current sustainability and climate-related standards by the ASRS provides a very good framework of what climate scenario analysis should look like. And there are three main components to this, which we've summarized. The first is considering the different inputs that you would need to start compiling your climate scenario analysis. Anybody who's dealt with this kind of information know that there's a wealth and a series of different rabbit holes one could go down into in terms of understanding or trying to get what it is that you need for your scenario analysis. Firstly is to understand which scenarios you'd be using. In this regard, there is the consideration around transitional scenarios and what would be appropriate from that perspective, as well as your physical scenarios and what would be appropriate. What the standard really wants to understand is the motivation and the methodology that you've used to unpack and to identify these scenarios that are relevant to your business. Why is this relevant? Why is it relevant to your sector? And why is this particularly relevant to the climate risks that you've already identified? Perhaps as a step back, it's important to note that by the time you embark on a scenario analysis, you should already have an idea of the climate, both physical and transitional risks that you are dealing with. You also need to think about the time horizons used in your analysis. Different scenarios make use of different time horizons. You also need to understand what scope of your operations are covered by the specific scenario and the reporting period in which you are in relation to, or in which you've undertaken your risk assessment in relation to the scenario. As we've said, scenario analysis, not an exact science. There will be certain key assumptions that you will need to make in this regard. And again, from a standard perspective, this underpinning of methodological integrity and rigor is really important. So being able to explain why you've selected the scenario and the assumptions that you've made to input into the different scenarios is going to be really important. Typical aspects relate to macroeconomics. It relates to national and regional commitments, variations, policy environments. It relates to potentially developments in technology or changes in energy access. In addition, there'll be key metrics that you'll be able to use and to report. Think about earnings, costs. We've spoken about revenue. We've spoken about some of the aspects associated with quantifying information. These would be metrics that you can use as part of your scenario analysis and looking at the impacts on these metrics. Finally, there is, what is an investor going to use this information for? What does an investor want to get from this information? And ultimately, it boils down to what are faced by a company to build resilience in the face of able to sorry, there's just some back information in my ear. Where is the information being able to be packaged for an investor? And is this something that you could use to adapt to a changing economic context? As we've said, this is a summary of scenario analysis based on the standard. What is important is how and what you've selected, and to disclose that when you go through this information. I'm handing over to Linda for the closing remarks.
Thanks, Corinne. There's been a lot that we discussed here, and quite technical, quite detailed in terms of upcoming disclosures, the complex area of climate risk assessments, understanding the different types of risks and opportunities and how you do that, how you translate that into financial impacts and what kinds of potential financial impacts they can lead to. How do you bring that all together in disclosures, and how do you do that in a company setting, and how do you do that in private government? That there has been a lot, but we need to think about the bigger picture here. The climate change risk management is really part of your broader ESG management and strategy. As I said, it does ensure your longevity as a business. It does ensure the ability of the business to function not only now, but also in the future. And even now, there are plenty of businesses that are affected by climate and need to be dealing with the effects on an everyday basis. It allows you, instead of being reactive, to be proactive, planned, and as we know, an early adaptation is significantly less expensive than reactive, trying to react to the hazards and impact as they occur. And therefore, this really should be seen as part of your normal business risk management and also broader sustainability thinking and perspective. And that's what I call a holistic view on sustainability and performance, and integrating climate into that. It, of course, ensures that climate is considered across the broader ESG context, because your other sustainability goals will also be affected by climate. You will not be able to achieve very often your nature positive goals or certain social targets, because the nature will be affected by climate, because the communities will be affected by climate. And therefore, we need to see this in the bigger context. Working on climate establishes foundational data and ways of working with ESG topics. It gives you certain types of processes and systems in place and allow you to work on that in a bigger context and broader topics. I know I'm running it over time, so Karen has been pushing me forward with the slides, so I will not be discussing the broader context in the bigger and more, but you get the picture that really the climate should not be something that you look at in isolation. It should be part of your larger strategy, and it should be a natural part and integration in various aspects of business and managing a good, resilient, and sustainable business. The next slide was that Karen briefly flashed is the services that we provide along a maturity journey of a company as they go through sustainability. Climate is certainly not the only topic that we work on. We work on all sustainability topics, covering both environmental, social, and governance topics. And we are assisting companies that may be somewhere very early in that journey, maybe have never done anything on this, and we help and guide them through the whole process. Or we work with more advanced companies and assist them wherever needed, where they may need more complex support. So thank you very much for joining today and listening to us. We will open the floor for a few questions. We do have 4 minutes remaining for that. So do please come off mute if that's possible, or drop your question in Q&A or the chat. I did see one question coming through from Peter. Peter was asking specifically on how do we foresee conducting climate risk assessment for a software company? I did type a brief answer to that question. That the typical risks that we see for software companies are related to data centers and also to the critical infrastructure that is absolutely critical and necessary for software type of businesses, which would be your machinery, how your servers and how your just everyday computers react, let's say, to heat, increased heat waves, and also the vulnerability of data networks, for example, because probably that there's a lot of data exchange that needs to be sent along the data networks, and you need to be aware of that and assess whether any of these critical components that underlie software business would be affected by climate now, medium, longer term future. And there are certain actions that can be planned. Sometimes it can be keeping a parallel data transmission live in reserve, having a special agreement on that with maybe 2 independent network providers and so on. So there's certain actions that you can be planning to address that risk. Do not forget that it is important in the mandatory disclosures to translate those physical potential impacts into financial terms, into understanding. For example, if there's one data transmission line that connects the business with key client is cut for, let's say, a week, what is the financial impact of that on the business? Probably quite significant. And so that is sort of a very quick sort of overview of how you start thinking about it, on where the risks may be, and start assessing by them. And really the first point is start mapping out your operations and what are the critical elements that are absolutely necessary for you to continue your operations, and then start identifying whether any of these critical components would be affected by either physical or transition risks, and therefore also lead to financial losses. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any questions coming on the Q&A or the chat. Is there anyone who would
Linda,
like to
there was one question around the acute and longer term impacts of health, which is obviously an impact, and consideration should be a consideration across all economic and physical components, and how this will filter into broader organizational risk assessments. I'm happy to take a stab. I think that climate change has been completely, or the health sector has been completely underestimated in terms of the impacts of climate. We've seen the impacts now recently in the Middle East in terms of some of the religious pilgrimages that took place. We saw major impacts last year and the year before during the increased heat over the European summers. Heat has a major impact and a domino effect on several different health-related risks, and being able to incorporate that into your health, into your risk assessments is going to be critically important. The same case study that I used earlier, one of the risks associated was, as we've mentioned, was increased heat, and it did relate into a much broader and a wider health and safety related training around heat management and hydration. So absolutely, I think there needs to be a social element, and the consideration of health needs to be more effectively integrated into how we assess risk.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I absolutely agree. Health impacts will impact every single business because there is a clear correlation with rising heat and heat wave days and a loss of productivity and lower productivity, and even just even if your workers do not work out in the open air, although those industries will be heavily affected, there will be certain days where you simply cannot send out people work out outside simply because it's too dangerous. And so you will have lost productivity or no productivity on those days whatsoever. But even just your commute to work, is the commute, I don't know, is the train air conditioned? And in many places it is not. And what does it mean? Do we have fainting employees not being able to make it to the office because it's just too hot to get there? So there will be certain impacts, certainly. And the health sector itself needs to adapt, and that's clear. But we need to think about broadly what is the system risk. And Corinne illustrated it very well. You need to think about your own operations, your value chain, but then system-wide risks, and health impacts is one of those system-wide risks, absolutely. I now see more questions coming through, but we have unfortunately come to the end of the webinar. So we will try and provide a written answer to those that have just come through. Thank you very much for everyone who has joined. If anyone had any technical issues, do let us know. We can send through the recording and the slides for those who may not have been able to follow fully. Generally, the recording will be publicly available on our webinar site. And as a reminder, there's a link to our webinar site in the chat where you can also see our other webinars that are coming up in the coming weeks. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.